On June 12, 1896, in the rural farming community of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, Mary Kellerman stood before the altar of St. Michael's Lutheran Church in her wedding dress, exchanging vows with William Schneider. What happened in the hours following that ceremony would challenge everything the medical community understood about the boundary between life and death. 3 days later, on June 15th, Mary Kellerman would attend her own funeral in that same church, documented in records that still exist in the Pennsylvania State Archives, a case that defies rational explanation even today. But before we dive into this nightmare, if you're new here and love spine-chilling stories, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to be notified when the next one drops. Now, let's begin. Mary Kellerman was 23 years old. In the spring of 1890, the eldest daughter of Johann and Margaret Kellerman, German immigrants who had established their farm in Lancaster County 2 decades earlier, building a life from the rich Pennsylvania soil through determination and the support of their tight-knit Lutheran community. She had grown up in the rhythm of farm life, her childhood marked by Sunday services at St. Michael's, harvest festivals, and the unchanging cycle of seasons that governed everything in their world. Her engagement to William Schneider had been announced the previous Christmas, a union that pleased both families. As William was known throughout the community as a skilled carpenter whose craftsmanship could be seen in the new barn he had built for the Hoffman family, and in the intricate woodwork of the church's renovated altar. The courtship had been proper and traditional, conducted under the watchful eyes of both families, with Sunday afternoon walks and carefully chaperoned social gatherings at community events, exactly as their German Lutheran traditions demanded. The wedding preparations had consumed the Kellerman household for months, with Margaret and her daughters sewing Mary's wedding dress from cream-colored silk that Johann had purchased from a merchant in Philadelphia, a rare extravagance that demonstrated the family's pride and joy in their eldest daughter's marriage. The community had rallied around the preparations as they always did, with neighbor women contributing their specialty dishes for the wedding feast, the men arranging the church and preparing the Kellerman farmhouse for the celebration that would follow the ceremony, creating that sense of collective participation that defined their small farming community. Among those who would later bear witness to the impossible events were Reverend Friedrich Müller, who had baptized Mary as an infant and would perform her wedding ceremony, Dr. Hermann Weiss, the German-trained physician who had attended the community for 15 years and whose medical credentials were impeccable, Sarah Hoffmann, Mary's closest friend since childhood, who served as her bridesmaid, and Thomas Brenner, William's brother-in-law, who had helped arrange the wedding celebration and whose testimony would prove particularly significant in the days to come. Everything about Mary's life before that June morning suggested normalcy, happiness, and the promise of a future filled with the same simple certainties that had governed her parents' lives. She was healthy, vibrant, described by those who knew her as possessing a gentle disposition and a ready smile, with no history of illness beyond the common ailments of childhood. The wedding date had been set for June 12th, a Thursday chosen for its favorable weather and the completion of spring planting, allowing the farming community to gather without neglecting their fields. No one, not her family, not William, not Dr. Weiss with all his medical training, could have anticipated what would happen when Mary stood before that altar, or the horror that would unfold in the 72 hours that followed. The morning of June 12th, 1896, dawned clear and warm, with the kind of perfect weather that seemed to bless the union of Mary Kellerman and William Schneider, and by 10 o'clock that morning, St. Michael's Lutheran Church was filled with members of the farming community, their Sunday best pressed and proper, as Reverend Mueller conducted the ceremony with the same solemn dignity he brought to all the sacraments under his care. Mary appeared radiant in her cream silk dress, her cheeks flushed with what everyone assumed was the natural excitement of a bride, her responses to the wedding vows clear and steady, and William placed the simple gold band on her finger at exactly 10:43 a.m., according to the church records, sealing a marriage that would last only hours before tragedy struck. The ceremony concluded without incident, and the wedding party proceeded to the Kellerman farmhouse where tables had been set up in the yard, laden with the traditional German dishes that marked every significant occasion in their community. And for the first 2 hours of the reception, everything progressed exactly as weddings had progressed in Lancaster County for generations. But at approximately 2:15 p.m., Sarah Hoffman noticed that Mary had grown quieter than expected for a new bride, sitting rather than mingling with the guests. And when Sarah approached her friend, Mary mentioned feeling slightly dizzy, attributing it to the excitement and the heat of the day, a reasonable explanation that no one questioned at the time. Within 30 minutes, however, Mary's condition had noticeably deteriorated, her face losing color until her complexion appeared almost translucent, and she complained to William of difficulty breathing, describing a tightness in her chest that made each breath feel labored and insufficient. Several of the older women experienced in the care of the ill suggested she move inside to lie down, away from the afternoon sun. But before they could help her to the house, Mary's symptoms escalated with terrifying rapidity. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, her lips taking on a bluish tinge that immediately alarmed those nearest to her, and she grasped William's arm with what witnesses later described as desperate strength, her eyes wide with fear that suggested she understood something terrible was happening to her body. At exactly 3:47 p.m., according to Thomas Brenner's pocket watch, which he checked in the chaos that followed, Mary Kellerman collapsed completely, her body going rigid before falling limp in William's arms, her eyes rolling back until only the whites were visible, a sight that sent several women screaming and brought every man at the reception running to the scene. William lowered his bride to the ground as Johann Kellerman shouted for someone to fetch Dr. Weiss, and the women began the frantic attempts at revival that their folk knowledge provided, loosening Mary's dress, fanning her face, calling her name with increasing desperation. But Mary remained utterly unresponsive, her body limp and cooling, her chest showing no rise and fall of breath as the wedding celebration transformed into a scene of absolute horror in the Pennsylvania afternoon sun. Dr. Hermann Weiss arrived at the Kellerman farmhouse within 20 minutes of being summoned, his medical bag in hand, his face betraying the urgency he felt upon hearing that a healthy young woman had collapsed at her own wedding reception, and he immediately knelt beside Mary's motionless form where she lay in the grass, surrounded by horrified guests who stepped back to give the physician room to work. His examination was thorough and methodical, conducted with the precision that his training at Heidelberg University had instilled in him, and what he discovered sent a chill through his professional composure that 15 years of rural practice had never quite prepared him for. He pressed his fingers to Mary's wrist, searching for any flutter of pulse in the radial artery, then moved to her neck, where the carotid should have shown the strong beat of a young woman's heart. But there was nothing. No movement, no rhythm, only the terrible stillness of absent circulation. He placed his ear directly against her chest, listening for any sound of cardiac activity or respiratory effort, holding his breath to eliminate any interference, but he heard only silence where there should have been the steady percussion of life. Her pupils, when he lifted her eyelids, were fixed and dilated, unresponsive to the bright June sunlight that should have caused them to contract, a definitive sign that the brain had ceased functioning. He checked for any breath by holding a small mirror beneath her nostrils, an old technique that would reveal even the faintest exhalation. But the glass remained clear and unclouded. At 4:23 p.m., exactly 36 minutes after her collapse, Dr. Weiss stood and delivered the pronouncement that transformed Mary Kellerman from bride to corpse, informing the assembled witnesses that she had died, likely from either a catastrophic heart failure or a massive cerebral hemorrhage, conditions that could strike without warning even in the apparently healthy, though such sudden death in a young woman was extremely rare and deeply troubling to his medical understanding. The sounds of grief that erupted from Margaret Kellerman were described by those present as almost inhuman. The primal wailing of a mother who had watched her daughter exchange wedding vows only hours before and now confronted her death, while William Schneider stood paralyzed with shock, unable to comprehend how he had become both husband and widower in a single afternoon. The women of the community, recovering from their initial shock, began the somber preparations that custom demanded, carrying Mary's body into the farmhouse parlor where they would wash and dress her for burial, while Dr. Weiss returned to his office to complete the death certificate that would officially record Mary Kellerman's death, documenting the date, time, and his professional conclusion about the cause, signing his name to a legal document that would later become evidence in one of the most disturbing medical cases in Pennsylvania history. Mary Kellerman's body was carried into the farmhouse parlor and laid out on the heavy oak table that had served the family for Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings. Now draped in white linen and transformed into a bier where her corpse would remain for the customary 3-day wake that German Lutheran tradition demanded before burial. The women who prepared her body for viewing performed their somber duties with practiced efficiency, washing her limbs with water scented with lavender, dressing her in a white burial gown that Margaret had kept in a cedar chest for decades, combing her dark hair and arranging it around her shoulders in the style befitting an unmarried woman, though the gold band on her finger testified to her brief hours as a wife. The parlor was prepared according to the customs that governed death in rural Pennsylvania, with all mirrors covered in black cloth to prevent the deceased's spirit from becoming trapped, with candles placed at the head and foot of the makeshift bier, their flames casting shadows that danced across Mary's pale face throughout the night, and with windows open despite the June warmth to allow her soul its passage to heaven. Word of the tragedy spread rapidly through Lancaster County's farming communities, and by evening on June 12th, a steady stream of visitors had begun arriving at the Kellerman farmhouse to pay their respects, their hushed voices and whispered prayers filling rooms that had echoed with celebration only hours before, the wedding decorations still hanging in grotesque contrast to the scene of mourning. William Schneider maintained an almost constant vigil beside his bride, sitting in the straight-backed chair that had been placed next to the parlor table, his face a mask of incomprehension and grief, occasionally reaching out to touch Mary's hand, as if physical contact might somehow reverse the nightmare his wedding day had become. It was William who first noticed something that troubled him, a detail he mentioned to Sarah Hoffman when she came to sit with him during the long night, the observation that Mary's cheeks seemed to retain a faint flush of color, rather than the waxy pallor he had seen on other corpses at community funerals. But Sarah attributed this to the candlelight and the natural preservation that sometimes occurred in the hours immediately after death. Others who came to view the body remarked quietly among themselves about a lingering warmth to Mary's skin when they touched her hand in farewell, a phenomenon that several of the older women explained as normal for the first day, though some exchanged uneasy glances that suggested a discomfort they could not quite articulate. On June 14th, the coffin arrived from the undertaker in Lancaster, a simple pine box lined with white satin, and Mary's body was placed inside for the final viewing that would occur before her funeral service the following morning, her hands folded across her chest in eternal repose, or what everyone believed would be eternal, with no one suspecting that in less than 24 hours, those hands would move again. June 15th, 1896. Dawned with an oppressive humidity that hung over Lancaster County like a shroud, the kind of thick morning air that made breathing feel labored and caused the elderly to complain of pressure in their chests. And by 7 o'clock, the Kellerman farmhouse was already stirring with the final preparations that would transport Mary to St. Michael's Lutheran Church, for the funeral service scheduled to begin at 10. The family had maintained their vigil throughout the 3 days, with William spending each night in the parlor chair beside the coffin, his exhaustion evident in the dark circles beneath his eyes and the mechanical way he moved through the rituals that grief demanded of him. Margaret Kellerman, her face aged by sorrow, until she seemed to have lived years in these 3 days, approached the coffin for her final private farewell before the men would seal it for transport. And she later told Sarah Hoffman that something about Mary's appearance troubled her in a way she could not explain. Her sense that her daughter looked not like the corpses she had tended at other wakes, but rather like someone in a deep and peaceful sleep. Thomas Brenner and 3 other men from the community arrived with the wagon that would carry the coffin to the church, and they lifted the pine box with appropriate solemnity, securing it in the wagon bed with ropes to prevent any shifting during the 2-mile journey along the rutted country roads. The procession that formed behind the wagon moved slowly through the morning heat, with the immediate family following in their own conveyance, while other mourners either rode or walked behind in a line that stretched nearly a 1/4 mile, a testament to the community's grief and shock at a death so sudden and so tragic. When the wagon arrived at St. Michael's Lutheran Church at approximately 9:15 a.m., the men carefully carried the coffin inside and placed it on the wooden platform that had been constructed before the altar, the same spot where Mary had stood as a bride exactly 72 hours earlier. And Reverend Muller supervised the arrangement with the grave dignity that his calling required, though several witnesses later recalled that he paused during his preparations and stared at the coffin with an expression that suggested profound unease. The church began filling with mourners well before the scheduled service time. The pews packed with members of the Lutheran community and curious onlookers from neighboring townships who had heard of the bride who died at her own wedding, their whispered conversations creating a low murmur that filled the church with sound that seemed wrong somehow, discordant against the solemnity of the occasion. Johann Kellerman made the decision to open the coffin one final time before the service began, allowing those who wished to pay their final respects the opportunity to view his daughter, and a line formed in the center aisle as people filed past the open casket, many of them noting in hushed tones to one another that Mary looked remarkably well preserved for 3 days, that her color seemed almost natural, that if they had not known better they would have thought she was merely sleeping, observation that rippled through the gathered mourners with an undercurrent of something that felt increasingly like dread rather than simple grief. Reverend Friedrich Müller stood before the assembled congregation at 10:17 a.m., his Bible open to Psalm 23, his voice steady as he began the eulogy that would commit Mary Kellerman's soul to God's eternal care, speaking of her life as a faithful daughter of the Church, and lamenting the tragedy that had transformed a wedding celebration into a funeral in the span of 3 days, when suddenly, in the profound silence that followed his invocation of the Lord's comfort for the grieving, a sound emerged from the front of the church that would forever be seared into the memory of every person present. The sound was described differently by different witnesses in the testimonies they would later provide, with some calling it a scraping noise, others a soft thump, and several insisting it was more like a moan or an exhalation, but all agreed that it came unmistakably from inside the closed coffin that rested before the altar. Reverend Muller stopped mid-sentence, his face draining of color as he stared at the pine box, and for several seconds the entire congregation sat frozen in a silence so complete that the sound, when it came again, was heard clearly by everyone in the church. A definite movement, a shifting of weight inside the coffin that caused the wood to creak in a way that made several women gasp aloud. William Schneider was the first to move, lunging from his pew toward the coffin with a cry that was part hope and part terror, and Thomas Brenner was immediately behind him, both men reaching the platform as another sound emerged, this time clearly a moan, a human sound of confusion or distress that shattered any possibility that what they were hearing could be explained by settling of the body or natural processes of decomposition. The lid of the coffin, which had been closed but not yet nailed shut for the burial, was wrenched open by William's trembling hands, and what he saw inside caused him to stagger backward with a shout that sent waves of panic through the congregation, because Mary Kellerman's eyes were open. Her chest was rising and falling with shallow but unmistakable breaths, and her hand was moving weakly against the white satin lining as if trying to push herself upright. Dr. Weiss, who had been sitting near the front, rushed forward with his medical bag, his face reflecting absolute incomprehension as he bent over the coffin to examine the woman he had pronounced dead 72 hours earlier. And he would later testify that Mary's pulse, which had been completely absent on June 12th, was now present and measurable, weak but steady at approximately 40 beats per minute. The church erupted into chaos as people surged forward to witness the impossible scene. Others fled toward the doors in superstitious terror. Several women fainted in their pews, and Margaret Kellerman's screams of joy mixed with the sounds of prayer and exclamation until Reverend Muller, recovering his composure, shouted for order and for someone to bring water and blankets. Mary's eyes, though open, showed confusion and disorientation, her lips moving soundlessly as if trying to speak. And when Dr. Weiss asked her if she could hear him, she responded with a weak nod that confirmed beyond any doubt that Mary Kellerman, 3 days dead and minutes away from burial, was somehow impossibly alive. Dr. Weiss conducted his second examination of Mary Kellerman with hands that trembled despite his years of medical training, checking every vital sign that had been absent 3 days earlier and finding them all present, diminished and weak but undeniably there. Her pulse threading but regular, her respiration shallow but consistent, her pupils now reactive to light in a way that proved neurological function had somehow returned from whatever abyss it had occupied since June 12th. Mary herself appeared profoundly disoriented, her eyes moving across the faces that surrounded her with an expression of confusion and fear. And when Dr. Weiss asked her simple questions about her identity and circumstances, she responded in a whisper so faint that he had to lean close to hear her confirm that she was Mary Kellerman, that she remembered her wedding ceremony, but that everything after speaking her vows existed in her memory as nothing but darkness, a complete void where 3 days of her existence should have been. Her physical condition was severely compromised, her muscles weak as if she had been bedridden for weeks rather than days, her skin cold to the touch, despite the June warmth, and she complained of terrible thirst and a sensation that her body felt distant and strange, as if it belonged to someone else and she was merely inhabiting it temporarily. The congregation of St. Michael's Lutheran Church struggled to process what they had witnessed, with some interpreting Mary's revival as a divine miracle, a sign from God that death itself could be reversed through faith and prayer, while others whispered darker theories involving supernatural forces that had no place in proper Lutheran theology, but seemed to offer the only explanation for the impossible. The decision was made to transport Mary back to the Kellerman farmhouse immediately, and she was lifted from the coffin with extraordinary care, wrapped in blankets that had been brought from the church vestry, and carried to the wagon in a scene that reversed the morning's funeral procession in a way that felt surreal and nightmarish to all who participated. In the days that followed, Reverend Muller took the unprecedented step of recording detailed testimonies from everyone who had been present at the church, recognizing that what had occurred needed to be documented with the same precision that the church applied to births, marriages, and deaths. And what emerged from these testimonies was a remarkable consistency in the accounts, despite the chaos and emotion of the moment, with every witness agreeing on the fundamental facts of what they had seen and heard. Dr. Weiss, perhaps most disturbed of all by the medical impossibility he had participated in, wrote a detailed report of both examinations that he submitted to the Pennsylvania Medical Society, comparing his findings from June 12th, when Mary had shown every clinical sign of death, against his findings from June 15th, when those same signs had reversed, creating a document that would circulate among medical professionals for years as evidence of how little even trained physicians understood about the boundary between life and death in the final years of the 19th century. Dr. Weiss spent weeks researching medical literature in an attempt to understand what had happened to Mary Kellerman, consulting texts from his training at Heidelberg and corresponding with colleagues in Philadelphia and New York, and he eventually arrived at a diagnosis that, while providing a medical framework for the impossible events, did little to diminish the horror of what had nearly occurred. His revised conclusion was that Mary had suffered an episode of catalepsy, a rare neurological condition in which the body enters a state of profound rigidity and suspended animation that so closely mimics death that even trained physicians could be deceived by its presentation. In cataleptic states, muscle tone becomes fixed. Metabolism slows to nearly undetectable levels. Breathing becomes so shallow that it cannot be perceived without instruments that did not exist in rural Pennsylvania in 1896. And the heartbeat diminishes to a rate so faint that pulse-taking by hand, the primary diagnostic tool available to Dr. Weiss, would fail to detect it. The condition had been documented in medical literature since ancient times, with cases recorded throughout Europe of individuals pronounced dead who later revived, sometimes in their coffins, sometimes on dissection tables, and occasionally, most horrifically, after burial, when scratches found on the inside of exhumed coffins testified to their desperate final moments underground. The Victorian era was particularly haunted by fears of premature burial, an anxiety so widespread that inventors had designed elaborate safety coffins equipped with bells and breathing tubes, and the medical community had engaged in heated debates about how to definitively determine death, with some physicians advocating for waiting periods before burial, while others suggested more invasive confirmation methods. What saved Mary Kellerman was precisely the German Lutheran tradition that her community practiced faithfully, the custom of maintaining a 3-day above-ground wake that allowed time for the impossible to reveal itself before she was committed to the earth. Had she been buried according to the expedited schedules that hot weather sometimes demanded, or had her family not adhered so strictly to traditional practices, Mary would have awakened 6 feet underground in a sealed coffin, her revival becoming not a miracle, but a horror beyond imagination. Dr. Weiss's explanation provided scientific credibility to the events at St. Michael's Church, transforming the supernatural into the medical. Yet his report acknowledged with remarkable honesty the limitations of 1890's diagnostic capabilities and the terrifying reality that physicians of his era were operating with tools and knowledge insufficient to definitively distinguish between certain rare conditions and actual death. The case of Mary Kellerman stood as stark evidence that the line between life and death, which medicine claimed to understand and mark with certainty, was far more ambiguous and treacherous than anyone wished to acknowledge. Mary Kellerman lived for 38 years after her awakening in St. Michael's Lutheran Church, dying of natural causes in 1934 at the age of 61, having borne 4 children with William Schneider and becoming a grandmother whose later life bore no outward indication of the medical horror she had survived, though those who knew her well reported that she maintained a profound fear of sleep and an obsessive insistence that her own eventual death be verified beyond any possibility of error. The events of June 1896 transformed burial practices throughout Lancaster County's German Lutheran communities, with families demanding extended wake periods, and some even requesting that small bells be attached to the hands of their deceased relatives as a precaution against premature interment. And Dr. Weiss became an advocate for more rigorous death verification protocols, corresponding with medical societies about the need for multiple examinations before burial could proceed. The documentation that surrounds Mary Kellerman's case remains preserved in the Pennsylvania State Archives, including the original death certificate signed by Dr. Weiss on June 12, 1896, the amended medical report he filed after her revival, the detailed testimonies collected by Reverend Muller from church members who witnessed her awakening, and the church records that note both her wedding and her funeral on the same page, in a juxtaposition that captures the compressed horror of those 3 days. Modern medical understanding suggests that Mary likely suffered from a severe cataleptic episode, possibly triggered by the stress and excitement of her wedding day, a condition that would be better diagnosed today with EEG monitoring and other technologies that can detect brain activity imperceptible to physical examination. Though even contemporary medicine acknowledges that certain states of profound metabolic suppression can challenge our ability to definitively pronounce death. The case endures as a reminder of humanity's oldest and most primal fear, the terror of being buried alive, an anxiety that consumed Victorian society and manifests differently, but no less powerfully in our modern fear of being declared dead prematurely or having life support withdrawn while some spark of consciousness remains. What makes Mary Kellerman's story particularly significant is not just the medical mystery it represents, but the meticulous documentation that proves this was not folklore or legend, but a witnessed, recorded event that challenged everything the medical community believed it understood about mortality. The records remain available for examination at the Pennsylvania State Archives in Harrisburg, housed in temperature-controlled storage alongside thousands of other documents from Lancaster County's history. A paper trail that testifies to the day a bride attended her own funeral and survived to tell a tale that reminds us how thin and uncertain the boundary between life and death truly remains.